Hey guys, Colin here at ShiftSynth1. Welcome to my fourth video on the Novation Circuit Editor. Today we're going to be covering the ModMatrix. In the Pro Editor, this section is at the bottom of the editor, and if you're using the free editor, it should be right around this area of the editor, and it should be tabbed. In the Pro Editor, the ModMatrix is all laid out for you. There are 20 modulation slots. Each of these slots has the ability to modulate a specific parameter using a source. We're going to investigate those sources, but as you can see, each slot has two available sources to modulate a destination. Now, the modulation occurs primarily in two ways. The first is that you utilize a macro knob to modulate the depth of the slot. This is the primary way that people tend to use the mod slots. You can also just adjust the depth directly within the slot itself. So if you actually go to the destination of a macro knob, you can see that every single one of the mod matrices is available to select. And all that does is adjust the slot relative to the depth of the macro knob. Now, today's lesson, we're going to just focus on these first two slots. And we're going to spend most of our time on just the first slot. But as you can see, I've initialized a patch here. And all default modulation slots contain two direct sources and a destination to the oscillator 1 and 2 pitch. So the source's default as direct basically just means that you are directly adjusting the modulation using the mod depth. There's nothing triggering the modulation. So for example, if I'm modulating oscillator 1 and 2 pitch, and I'm going to play a tone here, and then I've changed the mod 1 depth, it will just raise the pitch. And if I bring it down to a negative, it will lower the pitch. So pretty simple. So if I investigate the source tab, you'll see several available triggers for the modulation. Now, I want to point out that the first three after direct are not available on the Novation circuit. These are carryovers from the Mini Nova. The mod wheel is the mod wheel available on the Mini Nova that is not actually available on the Novation circuit. The aftertouch is aftertouch that's available on the Mini Nova, and the expression is the expression pedal that is available on the Mini Nova, and none of those are available on the Novation circuit as of now. So the first one you should be aware of is the velocity. Velocity is how hard you strike the key. Keyboard is the same as key tracking here, which I'll get into at a later class, but basically it means that if the mod source depth is positive, that the trigger is more powerful as you move up the keyboard. LFO 1 plus is a certain style of low frequency oscillator that I will get into in the next lesson, and so is LFO 1 plus minus. And LFO2 and LFO2 plus minus are applicable to the second LFO. And then there's one for each of the available envelopes. It just lets you trigger a modulation with any of the envelopes. Now, you should play around with each of these, figure out what each one does, but I'm going to do a few examples just to illustrate the effect of these on the modulation matrix. However, if we investigate the destination, you'll see modulation parameters. Now, I have not gotten into anything after the pulse width draw index, and I'll get into those in a later class. So I'm going to focus up here at the top. You'll recognize these from an earlier class. I'm actually going to modulate the V-Sync for this class because it's such a powerful modulation tool and you can hear it so clearly with your ears. So I'm going to click on that. And just as an example, I'm going to use velocity because velocity is a very clear modulation source and you will be able to see it on my screen. And I'm going to adjust the mod depth pretty high here. So oscillator 1's V-Sync is being oscillated by the velocity of how hard I strike the pads on my Novation circuit. So just to show you how this works, if I gently press this, you won't hear the V-sync at all. But as I increase the pressure, you can hear that the oscillator 1 V-sync kicks in pretty quickly. So what does the second source here do? So the second source allows you to add an additional trigger for that modulation. So let's say I want to add an LFO to that. So what I just did was I added a low frequency oscillator to the oscillator 1 V-sync that will also vary with the velocity in which I press the pad. Let me show you how that works. You can barely hear it. Now what if I strike it? There you go. So if I take the LFO 1 as the first source and velocity as the second, you'll see that it's the same effect. There's no difference between changing the source 1 and source 2 parameter. They both feed simultaneously into the destination. Now, another important thing to note is that when you're using combined sources in the same mod slot, they both use the same modulation depth. So if I were to take slot 2 and make this one the source of the velocity, and then take source 1 as direct, and make this destination oscillator 1 V-sync, and then change this to 60, what you'll see is that slot 1 and slot 2 are now additive. It will take half as much velocity power to trigger the same reaction as it would have when I did slot 1 originally. So here, check it out. I barely pressed it, and it already triggered a severe modulation reaction. So be careful of that when you're using multiple slot sources on a single destination. You'll see in presets that a lot of people do it this way, and because of that, they have to reduce the mod depth in order to compensate for that additive effect. So if you want two sources modulating the same destination and not have to mess with the additive, be sure to consolidate your sources. So there is a difference between using two sources in one slot on a single destination and two sources on two different slots on a single destination. So be sure to keep that in mind. The other thing I wanted to show you guys is that the mod depth can be turned negative. So if I were to take this to -60 and then take this to 0 and the velocity to direct, set that back to default, and then change the source to velocity. So then if I take the V-sync depth up and have oscillator 1 having a V-sync of 70, this will kick down that V-sync level as I increase my velocity. So just to show you how that works, if I have a soft velocity, this is going to have a high V-sync level. And then as I hit harder, it's going to dull that. So that's how that works. That just about wraps it up for the ModMatrix section. I know this area can seem rather confusing, especially if you don't understand the definitions of the sources and destinations, and you're not exactly sure how the modulation depth works or how to apply that appropriately. But the best way to understand this is to really just play around with it once you have a fundamental understanding of how these things operate. Now, the reason I wanted to explain the ModMatrix to you in this lesson instead of later on in the course is because in our next class we're going to be covering the low frequency oscillators. And you can't actually use a low frequency oscillator unless you're applying it via the ModMatrix, because a low frequency oscillator requires a destination in order for it to work. So that's kind of the vision of the class and the vision of the course going forward. I hope you guys enjoyed this course. Please feel free to leave me feedback or any questions you might have. I'm more than happy to answer it. Alright, thanks guys. I'll see you in the next class.